All right, so let's jump right in. The Bible, it's this massive collection, right? 66 different books, written over thousands of years. But what if I told you that deep down, it's not just a collection? What if there's a single hidden story woven through all of them? A huge epic narrative that kicks off on page 1 and doesn't wrap up until the very last sentence. Well, today, that's exactly the story we're going to explore. So we're not just talking about, a bunch of separate laws or prophecies or history lessons. No, the idea we're digging into today is that underneath all of that, there's one single epic conflict. A rivalry so fundamental that it basically defines the entire biblical saga from start to finish. And what is that conflict? It's a tale of two cities. That's it. Babylon versus Jerusalem. Think about it like this. One city is all about human ambition. It's a city we try to build for ourselves, by ourselves. The other, that's the city of divine promise, the one built by God. And this rivalry, this fundamental choice between two ways of living, well, that's the engine that drives the whole plot. Okay, so to really see this conflict in its sharpest, clearest form, we're actually going to do something a little weird. We're going to start at the end of the Bible. Yep, we're jumping straight into the book of Revelation. Because this is where that choice between the two cities becomes, well, it's just incredibly stark. You can't miss it. So, in these final chapters, the Bible personifies these two cities as two very different women. On one side, you've got Babylon, presented as the great whore. And on the other, you have the bride, who is the New Jerusalem. I mean, the imagery here is just so powerful, and it's absolutely meant to be polarizing. And just look at the contrasts here. They are so deliberate, they're practically perfect mirror images of each other. You've got an angel showing John the whore out in a desolate wilderness, right? But then another angel shows him the bride from a great and high mountain. Total opposites. And check out the use of wealth. Babylon is decked with gold and jewels. It's all jewelry, external decoration. But for the New Jerusalem, those exact same materials, gold, precious stones, pearls, they're not just jewelry. They are the very building blocks of the city. It's a really clear contrast between superficial flash and true internal substance. This kind of mirrored structure actually has a name. It's a fancy literary device called a chiasm. But honestly, the easiest way to think about it is like a narrative sandwich, right? You've got your first piece of bread, idea A. Then you add something else, idea B. Then you get to the most important part, the filling in the middle, let's call it X, and then you repeat B and A in reverse to close it out. The whole point of doing this, it's to make you focus all of your attention right on what's in the center. And what we're looking at here in Revelation, well, the argument is that these chapters are framed as a perfect chiasm. It kicks off with Babylon the whore, that's our A. Then, right in the middle, you get the X, the central point, the arrival of the bridegroom Jesus. And what comes immediately after that? The introduction of the New Jerusalem, the bride. That's our A prime. The whole structure is designed to force a choice, and it all pivots on the bridegroom, who rejects one city and chooses the other. Okay, so this conflict is crystal clear at the end of the Bible, but where did it all start? Where did it come from? To figure that out, let's rewind a bit. We're going to jump back to an earlier chapter in the story, the book of Daniel, because this is where you see the conflict isn't just in the story itself. It's literally baked into the very language of the book. Now, the book of Daniel is pretty unique. Why? Because it's bilingual. Parts of it are written in Hebrew, and other parts are written in Aramaic. And this is not some random accident. The argument is that this switch in language is actually a key that unlocks the whole book's central theme. So here's how it breaks down, and this is really cool. The chapters that are all about Jerusalem, they're written in Hebrew. But the chapters that are set inside Babylon, those are written in Aramaic. And Aramaic itself is super symbolic here. It was the language of the empire, kind of like a linguistic echo of that whole confusion of languages that started way back at the Tower of Babel, which, of course, is Babylon. So the very structure, the language of the book itself, is constantly reinforcing this tale of two cities. So you can see this conflict has some seriously deep roots. But to find where it really began, its ultimate origin, we've got to go all the way back. I'm talking back to the very first book, the first story, the first words. Yep, we're going to Genesis. Now, the source material points out something absolutely fascinating here. It has to do with the Hebrew word for beginning. It shows up, of course, in Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God created, the start of God's whole creation. But then it shows up again in Genesis 10:10, marking the start of Nimrod's kingdom. And what was the beginning of his kingdom? It's explicitly named Babel or Babylon. So you have two totally different kingdoms introduced with the exact same really significant Hebrew word, beginning. That's not a coincidence.
So the whole argument here is that we should read Genesis 1 as more than just a creation story. We should read it as the story of the founding of a kingdom. The text is just packed with royal clues. I mean, the phrase, in the beginning, is used elsewhere to talk about the start of a king's reign. God creates by speaking, like a king issuing royal decrees. He even creates rulers, the sun, the moon, and humanity, to govern his new realms. Every little piece seems to point to the establishment of God's kingdom. And when you see it that way, the parallel with Nimrod's beginning of Babylon becomes this direct, intentional rivalry right from the get-go.
And this right here, this is the fundamental ambition of Babylon. It's a totally human-centric project. Listen to the language. Come, let us build for ourselves a city, and let us make for ourselves a name. It's all about us, us, us. It's about humanity trying to achieve its own significance through its own effort. But then, what happens right after God shuts down the whole Tower of Babel project, like in the very next story? God calls Abraham, and he makes a promise that is the perfect mirror opposite. He says, I will make you a great nation, and I will make your name great. You see the difference? It's all about who's doing the building, who's doing the name-making. That's the crucial contrast. And right there, that's the conflict in its purest, most elemental form. It's the city of human self-reliance versus the city of divine promise. It's human ambition versus God's covenant. And this is the choice that echoes from the first pages of Genesis all the way to the end of Revelation. All right, so looking at the Bible through this Tale of Two Cities lens is a pretty powerful way to read it. But it also helps clarify some really big, long-standing debates, like what does Babylon actually represent by the time we get to the end of the story? Now, a really common interpretation is that Babylon in Revelation is actually just a code word for earthly Jerusalem. And that makes some sense, right? Because the Old Testament prophets sometimes describe a disobedient Jerusalem as a prostitute. So a lot of people argue that when Revelation talks about destroying Babylon, it's really a prophecy about the destruction of Jerusalem back in 70 AD. But the source we're looking at today offers a different take. In this framework, Babylon isn't just a single place. It's not the literal city in Mesopotamia, and it's not a stand-in for Jerusalem either. Instead, Babylon is an idea, a system. It's this symbolic, great city that represents the conglomeration of all human kingdoms that set themselves up in opposition to God's kingdom. It's more of a way of life, a worldview. So with this understanding, the argument isn't that first-century Jerusalem became Babylon. It's that earthly Jerusalem was conquered by the version of the Babylonian system that was dominant at the time, which was the Roman Empire, and it started to adopt Rome's corrupt practices. In other words, Jerusalem fell to Babylon. It didn't become Babylon, and that's a crucial distinction that keeps the two-city conflict intact all the way to the end. So when you kind of pull the camera back and look at the whole picture, you really start to see it. This isn't just a random collection of disconnected stories at all. It's one single coherent narrative about a cosmic choice, a choice that gets presented to humanity over and over and over again. And what it all boils down to is this. It's a story about two competing visions for our future. There's the city we build for our own glory, which is always temporary, and then there's the city that God builds for his glory, which is eternal. You know, looking at the Bible this way, as one single, carefully structured, deliberate story, it really opens up a whole new way of reading it. And it can't help but make you wonder, if this huge narrative has been hiding there all along, woven from the first word to the last, what other patterns, what other stories might just be hiding there in plain sight?